Please welcome back Justin Davidson.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Chris Cooper, to my left from SOM, Layla Law-Gisiko from the Central Park Sunshine Task Force of Manhattan Community Board 5, Janno Lieber from the World Trade Center Properties, and Angela Pinsky from the Association for a Better New York. And we're going to talk about when and where to build supertalls. I think when we go beyond this room and we ask or talk to New Yorkers who are not professionally involved in development or architecture, they tend to think that developers will put up the tallest tower that will make the most money, and that architects will design it for maximum yield, and not for the civic good. And so there's a kind of adversarial relationship built into the process from the get-go. So, Chris, are they wrong? I mean, how does SOM approach a 1,000-foot-plus building and make it good for the city and not just for the client?
Well, I think we all know that New Yorkers are never wrong.
No matter what opinion they hold, even if they conflict.
But it does, the ethical aspect of this question is certainly relevant, and it points to the fact that as architects, as developers, we do have a civic responsibility when building at this scale. And we know, none of us can dispute that building at this scale has impacts that far outreach the boundaries of our immediate site. And as you clearly presented, this is a question that New Yorkers have been asking ourselves for generations. And we've seen New York grow in fits and spurts as technology has changed, as engineering has advanced, as economics have evolved. And we've seen these sprouts come up. And there have been questions about shadow, there's been questions about impact on street. We've built a very robust, very sophisticated zoning ordinance to try a resolution to maintain this. And it's what gives us the vibrant, dense city that we have all grown to love. I think that Manhattan has embraced density. I think height is not the issue, and I would venture to put out in this conversation that we can qualify or quantify the shadows, et cetera, but perhaps this has more to do with identity and civic identity, and that and what is that identity for, and who is identifying the skyline and what we all know as New York. So I think maybe it is actually a question of quality of these projects, maybe more than their height. And so that is something that we all do need to continue to push as professionals and as we think forward. And as with my client here, we certainly know that architects aren't always pushing efficiency as the final motivator.
So if the towers are good enough, people will come to love them.
I think that they define our skyline, they define our city, and if they have enduring integrity as the icons that we have grown to love over time, that have been the outliers over time, that they are an important part of New York City.
So Layla, you're here representing CB5 and particularly the Central Park Sunshine Task Force. Mm-hmm. So we know some of the impact that some of the super tall residential towers on 57th Street have already provided. We've seen flying windows and teetering cranes and shadows that we've just been talking about, and then towers where nobody actually lives, so there's no trick-or-treating. So we know CB5 has a lot of objections, as do many people. What would you like to see change, whether it's in the city's rules or practices or how we look at these towers?
Yeah. So I think that currently the zoning code does not address what these buildings are doing. You know, the notion of an as-of-right building was understood as being a building that we know is going to be innocuous. It's the building that we know is not going to produce any negative impact. These buildings,
as-of-right buildings.
An as-of-right building. These buildings are as-of-right, and yet we know that they produce vast impacts. And whether they're negative or not, we need to analyze that and assess and study what impact they're producing. We cannot just decide that, well, because maybe our zoning code is antiquated, we're just going to take whatever comes our way. The last time it was revamped was in 1961. It is about time, it will be the centennial of the zoning law altogether next year, and it needs to be updated. I think that, beyond the notion of the identity that these buildings give to New York, it is a responsibility to say, well, let's look at the impact that they're producing. They're producing shadows. Do we want these shadows? Do we want to mitigate the impact of these shadows? How can we do that? Right now, there's no mechanism in the existing code to do that. And as a result, we see that the only driving force for the construction of these buildings are economic. There's a market for it, there's a demand for it, and the technology is there. But these criteria are not enough to cause good urban planning. And what CB5 is saying is, let's take a pause. Let's hit the pause button. It's a pause. It's not a ban. It's not, it's nothing majorly controversial that we're saying. We're just saying, in 20 years, unless we do something, this is what we're going to live with. And we don't want to be put in a position where we're going to be forced to love them or hate them forever. There's a better way to plan the city.
So when you talk about revising the zoning code, are you thinking in terms of height restrictions where there aren't any, adjusting the transfer of air rights rules, or bringing these shadow studies or these skyline views, sky views into consideration? I mean, are these buildings, should they be going through ULURP? I mean, what are we
So one example is, like, currently there is no mechanism in the zoning code to assess the impact of shadows produced by as-of-right buildings. And there's no mechanism to assess the cumulative impact of buildings in the shadow that they can cause onto a park. Let's fix that. It's easy. We do not want to plunge all our open space into shadows, whether it is Central Park, which is actually a big park in which you could say, well, maybe there's room to build higher and more dense buildings. But if you take other parks in our district, such as Bryant Park or Madison Park, this is very problematic. One building alone could cast the entire park, the entire open space that we residents, people who work in these particular neighborhoods, rely on to access to air and light, whether in summer or in winter. One building could obliterate the light. We need to change that. San Francisco did it. We can take our cues from them.
So I think it's important to distinguish when we're talking about supertalls that there really are two different kind of beasts. There's the residential towers, which really don't add density to the city because there are so few apartments in them. They're skinny. And large office buildings, which, from a design and engineering standpoint, are really very different creatures and an economic standpoint as well. And they also interact with the public in very different ways. So, Janno, you focus mostly on office buildings, so we're getting you off the hook. You're not responsible for the towers at 57th Street. But what's your response to Layla's feeling that these buildings...
Listen, you make a lot of strong points, and it's obviously an important discussion to have. I've been spending the last 13 years on building super tall, maybe not by the standards of the future, at least by today's standards, super tall office buildings down at the World Trade Center site. And I think that there's a lot in them that actually supports what we value as a community in New York. What density in the office context allows you to do is, first of all, it's the model of sustainability. You put a lot of people together in areas that have great mass transit, and that is fundamentally different than the way a lot of America has developed, where putting corporate office parks spread out along highways. So it is, I think, a very powerful alternative to things which are the opposite of sustainability, to concentrate workers together in places close to mass transit, and that means density. The other advantage is the density itself. In some ways, office buildings are very much more public buildings, and that's kind of what you were getting at. Justin, is because the density, which is now going down from what we used to say is 200 square foot per person, most of the tenants we're working with are densifying down to 100 or 150 square feet a person. So you're talking about a shared experience that affects a lot of people's lives, and putting smart people in close proximity to each other to create ideas and create economic activity is the essence of New York. So I think in some ways the tall or at least dense office buildings are very much in New York's heart and in New York's, the best things about New York's economic model. The other thing that they do, and I think the new office buildings hopefully are doing it, is there's more sensitivity, there has to be more sensitivity in how we plan the impacts at the street level. The experience of the street in the old World Trade Center, which is very much in our hearts, but had some disadvantages from a planning standpoint, was it was not lively at the street level. It had that underground mall and that open plaza. So we have to do, as much as the density upstairs matters and the relationship to mass transit matters, we have to create a streetscape that people really want to experience. So even though there may be, in some ways, whether it's shadowed or not, and certainly downtown where we have almost a medieval city in some ways, there are a lot of buildings in close proximity, but the streetscape has to be exciting, it has to be lively, it has to be New York. And if you combine a lively streetscape with access to waterfront and to open space, I think you're starting to address the issues of quality of life, even in a very dense context. So I think there are opportunities to have density to support New York's model, and also to have an exciting streetscape, which is what matters to a lot of people.
When you talk about density and mass transit, I can't help thinking of being on an actual subway car and the density you experience at rush hour. Obviously, these towers, density has its benefits. We all know that that's really a driving force in New York, but there's kind of a tipping point, isn't there? I mean, these towers do stress all of the systems, the infrastructure, even the open space and the sidewalks.
You're right. I mean, for New York to continue to develop and do the good things it's done and use this great model we have of smart people working close together and producing great ideas, you need to deal with the infrastructure. I mean, we downtown has great infrastructure, but 11 subway lines, but it happens to be the same subway lines that were built 100 years ago. And certainly the upgrades that we've had are great, but there could be a lot more and a lot more to deal with capacity. So Justin, I think you're absolutely right.
So Angela, obviously Supertall towers embody the economic vitality of the city. So when we look at these and fear, are New Yorkers just being provincial and short-sighted? Is it just a sort of classic knee-jerk reaction, oh my God, it's going to be so high? Or do we have to embrace those? And if so, what do you think? Are there rules? Do we need to look at the system differently for getting them where they are?
Well, I don't think it's short-sighted at all, and but I do think that as a city, we need to have a conversation that contends with the issue, with the fact that we, as a city, have become wildly successful in terms of desirability. And to your point before, I think that we can look at our population growth and see that whether or not we plan for it, whether or not we build for it, growth is going to come to New York. So last year, in 2004, our population hit 8.5 million people, which is a number that we weren't supposed to hit until 2020. That's 320,000 more people than 4 years ago, which at our current density needs 132,000 units of housing in order to accommodate. In that same period of time, we built, or the city permitted 44,000 units of housing, which is about a third of what we need. So, and in the same way, commercial properties are the same. We've grown about 425,000 jobs since the end of 2009, and now we're at 4.1 million jobs total, which is an all-time high. So I think that we need to have a process that looks at how do we contend with this growth as a city? And our current process, our Euler process about changing the zoning and allowing density in certain areas, I would say is somewhat of a deterrent or not an avenue that's entirely desirable because it tends to focus on the concerns of the local neighborhoods. And we have a number of these rezonings going on across the city where you're looking at a neighborhood and saying, should we put growth here? And I think that all of the concerns that are being raised by these neighborhoods are valid and they're legitimate and they deserve a chance to be heard, but we need to have a space to be able to have a conversation to say, okay, if we're not going to put the people, the density in these areas like 57th Street, where we already have a lot of density, where we have a lot of infrastructure, where we have a lot of quality of life amenities, what are the consequences of putting it elsewhere? If we don't build for it, is the cost of housing going to get more expensive in New York City? Are we going to end up pushing this density into areas where we don't have as much infrastructure? Or are we going to start creating pressures on other types of land uses like industrial or commercial or retail in areas where we want those types of uses preserved?
So,
Can
yeah,
I
please.
quickly respond to that? I think it's very interesting as it pertains to Community Board 5 district. It's really important to keep in mind that there's absolutely no increase in density on 57th Street. There's a tremendous increase in height, but the efficiency of these buildings is actually very, very poor. There's no discussion about affordable housing in these buildings, which could be a part of it.
For some people, $60 million is affordable.
There's no, there's no framework, to even start this conversation. So, I think it's important to understand that we actually are creating very, very inefficient buildings with, we have also to realize that we're dealing with finite resources. I mean, how much marble are we going to use over the years to build all these bathrooms? And there's something a little strange that we would demolish, rebuild, based on driving forces that have not been discussed among all the parties.
So, Angela, do you think that Supertalls, if we're talking about residential Supertalls, can they address our density problems? I mean, Layla's right. The ones we've had so far are actually lowering density.
Well, I think you're picking a couple examples, but if you look at the Beekman Tower downtown, that has over 900 units of housing in it. And if you're going to apply those same numbers to Brownstone, Brooklyn, you have to take about 10 blocks in order to create the same density as you have in that one building, which also, by the way, has a school and some community facilities in there as well. So I do think, I think that there are going to be some instances where you're not going to create more efficiencies, but I think we have to have, again, these discussions comprehensively and say, okay, what are we going to do as a city? This growth is coming whether we prepare for it or not, and we have an obligation to plan for a smart, efficient, capable city that has the capacity to grow.
So, Janno and Chris, I want to ask you, financial services really hasn't been growing as a sector in terms of jobs that much in recent years. Tech has. But those companies seem to be interested in different kinds of buildings. Is all of the emphasis on these super tall Class A, highly dense office buildings, are we building the right kind of office space for the future?
I actually think that it's a very good question. I think that we are. Obviously, a lot of folks in the tech industry, I mean, the Google space on was it 15th Street, is sort of a model of what people think the tech industry wants, which is, sort of these large, super large floor plates and a lot of horizontality and so on. What we're finding is that the appeal of that, which became in some ways cultural, it was driven initially by cost choices, and then became sort of ingrained in the culture, is actually over time giving way to the issues of the efficiency of the building. So new buildings don't have a lot of columns. They have mechanical systems that can support real density in a way these older buildings that were obviously became characteristic of the so-called technology, TAMI tenants, technology, advertising, media, and information. That's the new watchword of our economy, actually. But so those tenants are increasingly looking at the ability to densify and the efficiency of the new buildings, and also the quality of life. I mean, when you're dealing with an industry where people work with their brains, and that's how they create value, access to natural light, views, quality of air, all the things that new buildings offer go to productivity in the business model. So you're correct that in some ways we have this snapshot right now of that industry going in these horizontal type models. But the World Trade Center, for example, is increasingly getting talent, companies like Media Math and so on, that are in that technology space. And obviously media has moved downtown. So I think there's a shift taking place that actually validates the value of the new buildings.
So this is a conversation I would love to extend over dinner, over a long evening. There's a lot to talk about. We've only
And at the
scratched
city
surface.
council.
And of course, at city council. But we live by the clock, so thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.